Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Linguistics 341, Introduction to Phonetics. I am Steve Winters. I'll be your professor for the semester. I guess I'll say, just as to put this all in context, that I'm making these videos a bit ahead of time to kind of anticipate the fact that we're probably going to be doing online teaching again in winter 2021. So I haven't met you yet. I'm looking forward to it though. But I'm going to put these all online, and presumably we'll be doing this in a mostly asynchronous manner, which I think should work out reasonably okay because of my experience with the asynchronous teaching that I did at the end of winter semester last year when the pandemic hit. But at any rate, I am planning on making myself available as much as possible to help you through this course and help you learn as much as you possibly can about phonetics. It just probably won't be through direct contact all that much, or synchronous contact, I guess, all that much. Also helping me out this semester is Kody Tufts, my teaching assistant. Kody was a student in this class 3 years ago. Hopefully he won't be too embarrassed if I say that he got an A+ in this class. He was an excellent student and still is an excellent student. He's also a very nice guy, so I'm sure he'd be happy to help you out if you have any questions about the material in this course as well. He's also going to be doing your grading primarily for this course, so you might want to be nice to him for that reason as well. I'll leave that up to you. Okay, so just as another sort of preface to everything I'm going to say here in the first lecture for the class, that with this class, as is normally taught, I generally assume that it may have been a while since you've taken Linguistics 201, or maybe you haven't thought about phonetics a whole lot since then either. So I kind of start out with a basic review of what phonetics is all about and how to apply it to English. So we spend actually kind of the first week or two just focusing on that to kind of get our bearings back again for doing phonetics. And then we move on to sort of more exciting things in different languages and exciting things like acoustic phonetics, which I'll talk about here in just a second. So sit tight. You may have already seen some of this stuff before. You may remember a lot of it before, but I just want to make sure we're all kind of on a level playing field as we get started before we start doing some difficult material in phonetics throughout the rest of the semester. So what is phonetics? I've been talking about it already, and I think you may remember, at least in general, that phonetics is a scientific study of speech sounds. It consists of three main subfields. And the first of these is what you work on primarily in Linguistics 201. It's called articulatory phonetics. So this is the study of how speech sounds are produced by the organs of speech that you have in your vocal tract, your tongue, your lips, your vocal folds, so on and so forth. How am I moving all this stuff in here to get sound out of my mouth so that other people can perceive and understand it? So this is a nice way to get started because, you know, there are physical objects in here, which we kind of have a sense of like where they are and what they feel like when they're moving around. So you kind of know what's happening there to give you a basic sense of what you do when you produce speech. Acoustic phonetics is the second sub-branch of phonetics that we're going to talk about in this class. We're going to start out, like I mentioned, with articulatory analysis. My mouse isn't working, but the second part of it will address acoustic phonetics, which is the study of how speech sounds are transmitted from producer to perceiver. And I may have talked about this a bit in my video on the course syllabus, but acoustic phonetics requires some basic understanding of physics and also some basic math. It's not too hard in this class. It might make you a little bit uncomfortable, but I know a lot of students get into linguistics because they feel like this may be a way to deliver them from the horrors of math forever, but you're not going to get away from it completely. So I'm just warning you ahead of time that in order to understand acoustics, you may have to do some addition and multiplication. Don't worry though, I'll guide you through it. One thing we aren't going to be able to get some work in on during this semester is perceptual phonetics, at least not in any serious way. But perceptual phonetics is the sort of third leg of the tripod of phonetics. And this is the study of how listeners understand which speech sounds are being produced. So I move the organs of speech around in my mouth somehow. Air comes out of my mouth and it's in the air in some acoustic form, and then eventually it gets to some listeners' ears, hopefully yours, and then it goes into your brain and you figure out what's going on. This is a really interesting topic, the perception side of it, and it's actually what I focus on a lot in my research for phonetics. But it's kind of and the reason why it's fun to study is because it's a mystery exactly what's going on in your brain. And it's kind of hard to chip away at that mystery to figure out what people are doing or what your brain is doing to understand the spoken world around you. So for the most part, I save that for Linguistics 441. Advanced phonetics, which you are welcome to take, of course, if you find this at all fascinating or interesting. I'd encourage you to do so. And perceptual phonetics, it also helps to have a solid foundation of an understanding about how both articulation and acoustics work before you get there. I will mention in passing, because I always kind of do this in class, but the very first time I taught intro linguistics a long time ago, I taught phonetics. I had a whole a couple lectures basically like this, where I walked through like the 3 different subfields of phonetics. And this was 20 years ago, but it was also a night class at Ohio State University, so it kind of brought in a different clientele than sort of the regular daytime classes that I had gone through when I was in school. So there was one interesting character who sat in the back row every class and contributed a lot of interesting thoughts to lectures. But when I walked him through this breakdown of how phonetics works, he raised his hand and he said, well, what about telepathy? Are we going to study that in phonetics? And I'm like, no, we're not going to study that. We're only going to study what happens in human communication when sound actually comes out of somebody's mouth in this class. So you can kind of limit it to that if you're worried about whether or not I'm reading your thoughts. Probably not, though. Anyways, what you will learn in this class, first of all, we're going to focus a lot on phonetic transcription by using what is called the International Phonetic Alphabet, and that goes by an abbreviation normally in linguistic circles of the IPA. So basically, how can you get the speech sounds that somebody produces down on paper in a way that's easily read and reproducible? Say more about that, but number 2, we're also going to learn how to produce the speech sounds of the languages of the world, including the exotic ones. My mouse still isn't working. Let me see if I can get it to work this way. Yeah. So the other part of this, I guess I should mention, and I probably talked about this in going over the syllabus too, but normally I try to devote about 1 session per week to phonetic transcription. And normally this is done in class together, face-to-face in person, and we kind of hash out. Everybody brings in transcriptions of like a set of sounds that I provided to you over the internet. And then we hash out whether we think somebody's done theirs right or wrong, or what they've done right or wrong in the transcription, to try to get a sense of, different perspectives on what things sound like to different listeners. I think I'm going to have to wind up doing this myself. You're all going to send them to me, and then I'm going to sort of walk you through the different transcriptions that I've received to sort of figure out what's gone right and what's gone wrong in them. And I'll post those videos later, so we can't really do it live as a group. But the main thing is that with phonetic transcription, it's tricky, and the only way you can really learn how to do it is through practice. And a little bit of misery, I guess, in terms of getting things wrong, because usually when you get things wrong, you don't do that thing wrong again. I'm not trying to intentionally inflict misery on you. I'm trying to intentionally inflict knowledge on you. And that's just one way to do it, hopefully not too painfully. Number 2, this might be a bit awkward as well, but you're going to learn how to produce the speech sounds of the languages of the world, including the exotic ones. So once we learn the IPA, we're going to go through all the various symbols and try to put those symbols in context so we can produce them ourselves. And then I can evaluate how well you do. So in that particular case, what you do is I post a series of transcriptions along with sound files that you can listen to of example speakers producing those transcriptions, and you try to imitate what they do using sounds that we don't find in English to make it interesting, kind of expand the possibilities of your mouth, you might say, in so doing. This is a good skill for any sort of trained linguist to have, because the better that you can actually produce speech sounds, the better you are at transcribing them, the more you know what they're supposed to sound like, basically. At least that's theory. It takes a lot of practice as well to do that well. And generally speaking, if you don't have sounds natively in your language, you maybe never quite get as good as a native speaker does, but you can get close enough to fool somebody. I know, for instance, Kody did a very good job of those when he was a student in this class. So he can give you some tips on that as well. Number 3, we'll learn the basics of the acoustic analysis of speech in addressing the topic of acoustic phonetics. It's super convenient to do this in the modern age with a computer using free software that's available on the internet, and I'm going to show you how to use it. It will broaden your life in many dramatic ways to see what's happening when we actually produce sounds, what's going on in the air around us as the sound gets transmitted through speech from one person to the other. Yeah, that is where the more technical part of the class sort of resides. So just be aware that this is going to happen primarily in the second half of the class. Yeah, before we get there though, like I said, we're going to focus more on phonetic transcription. What do I mean when I talk about phonetic transcription? And I guess I'll basically boil it down to the idea that you want to be able to represent speech as a sequence of segments using phonetic transcription. Another way to think about that is that when we transcribe speech, we use some sort of alphabetic representation to put it down on paper or, in a digital format that we can go back to later to understand what a person actually said when the sounds came out of their mouth as they were speaking. So this begs the question, well, if we're using an alphabet to represent speech, like what alphabet are we going to use exactly? For instance, we could think about using the English alphabet. Would that be a good idea, or might there be some problems with doing so? And if we don't want to use the English alphabet, then what other alphabets could we possibly use? I know, or at least I think I know, that I've kind of tipped off the answer to this question already in this lecture. I don't know if you were paying attention to that part of it, but before I tell you about what alphabet we are going to use, maybe we can focus on the English alphabet, one that we're all used to using, and kind of think about, well, what works in this alphabet and what does not. So normally I invite people to come up with like a variety of examples of what English spelling does not do well. And there are a lot of different things we could talk about, and I'm going to list a few here, some of which you may have already thought of. But one problem is that you can get letters which represent more than one different sound. And two kind of classic examples of this in the English spelling system are the letters C and G. So if I go way back in time to when I learned how to read, they would refer to the different forms or the different sound values of these letters as like the hard C and the soft C. So we have a hard C in recall because it's the K sound, and we have a soft C in receive because it's the S sound. Similarly, we get a hard G in gear, G, and then a soft G in siege. We're going to use different terms to describe these sounds as we learn phonetics in this semester, but maybe impressionistically that will still work for you, that this feels kind of hard, like a stop sound like K, and soft if it's a fricative sound like S. Either way, when we're trying to spell out what somebody has actually said, and then we're going to use like this symbol in a transcription, we don't want it to be ambiguous. We want to know every single time what this represents, and if it can possibly represent two different sounds, that's not doing us any good. In English, as I'm sure you know as well, that there are some letters that represent no sounds at all. Like the E's at the end of words like receive and use. You might call these silent letters, perhaps, which again is what they were called when I was learning how to read. Hopefully that hasn't changed because you don't actually use any sounds when you read out these words to correspond to these particular letters at the end of them. That doesn't mean they don't have any use in English spelling. So like, yeah, use, didn't intend that, but if we take away the E from this word, we get the word us. And then we add the E to it and use, it changes the value of the phonetic value of the letters that precede it, but that's way more complicated than we need to get into for phonetic transcription. We don't want to have letters representing different sounds based on their context. We want them to be consistently the same thing over and over again, so let's not get silent letters involved, please. There's another problem with English in that sometimes two letters can represent just one sound. So in phonetics itself, it starts off with a PH, which corresponds to the sound that is normally represented in English with the letter F. So phonetics, like what the heck, why are we using PH there? That's just weird. And the reason is there's actually, it turns out there's always a reason for the way we spell things in English, and they always are historical, basically. They go back to wherever we got these words. And phonetics is based on an ancient Greek word, the root of which is pone, which means sound, basically. And that started off with what's called an aspirated P, puh. It's like a P with a little puff of air right after it. I'll give you a demo of that in a second. but that's why it's spelled with a PH. Over time, that P sound in Greek changed to a F, which is kind of similar, at least in articulation and maybe a little bit in acoustics as well. So that P sound became F, and we just say phonetics. But that's another example of how this can go awry too, right? So my name is actually spelled with a PH. I called myself Steve when I introduced myself, but the way my name is spelled is S-D-P-H-E-N. And sometimes I like to joke around and call myself Stephen, but that's not actually how it's produced. It's just 2,000 years ago, there were Greek guys named Stepanos, and now that got converted to Stephen for some Steves in the modern world. Yeah, so this is problematic as well. We don't want to have, this is sort of like including a silent letter sort of, or more context in our spelling, so we don't want that. We don't have to sort of determine that this is not a P, just a F, so we can use a simpler spelling system for that in transcription. Some letters represent two or more sounds at once. Oh, yeah, sorry. The trick I was going to say here is the funny part of the PH in Stephen is that's a V sound, and this one's a F, so that's like involving two different problems at once. We're using the same letter sequence to represent more than one sound. So yeah, headache after headache for the English spelling system. Some letters represent two or more sounds at once, like the X in tax is a classic one, so it's a X sound. U's as well, like up here is a U. Rather than just a oo or a or what have you. So why don't we have two sounds representing the two different sounds that we produce in those sequences? We can also get the same sound represented by many different letters. So there's an esh sound, which you may think of as prototypically written down as sh in English, like in English at the end of that word, or shy, so on and so forth. But you can actually spell this in a variety of different ways, depending, again, on sort of the history of the word in which it's found. So mission, the esh sound is spelled, basically I interpret it as an SSI. Machine, which comes from French, so French is more consistent and typically spells that sound with a CH. So that's the way we spell the word machine in English. Special, it's spelled with a CI. Caution, it's spelled with a TI. And that actually leads me to a classic example of why English spelling is bad, at least if you're a phonetician. The writer George Bernard Shaw came up with this, but he said that we could have a word that's spelled like this in English that actually represents a real word in English. Yeah, do you guys know this joke? Or even if you don't, could you figure out how you're supposed to actually pronounce this word? George Bernard Shaw was like, well, this is the word fish. How did he get to that? So the joke is, I guess I'll squeeze it in up here, maybe down here. We get the GH from a word like cough. So that's a F sound. Don't do that, please. And then we get the O from a word like women. I don't want that, but in women, that O is pronounced like an I sound. And then the TI is from a word like nation or caution. So we have here like F for that, I for that, and then sh for the TI. So it's not Gahoti, it's fish. So for George Bernard Shaw, that was a slam dunk, right? Nobody was ever more clever than that as a writer. Famously so, it's existed for another 100 years, but it hasn't changed the spelling system of English at all. So we still put up with this insanity because English is not a spelling system that's devoted only to representing the way the language is pronounced phonetically. It represents other structures in the language, and then it also represents some of the historical origins of these words as well. And people are loath to change something so kind of fundamental in their lives, so it still exists the way it exists, right? If you're a speaker of Spanish or German or something else, you may look at this and say, this is crazy. Why do they do this? Why do we have to put up with this when we learn it? But that's the way it is. As phoneticians, I'm not advocating for changing the English spelling system at this point in time. I'm just going to say I'm going to teach you how to transcribe English phonetically or any language phonetically using a common universal alphabet where we don't have to worry about any of this stuff. before I move on from this, I'm going to tell you a little joke, though, which is that in the 70s, one thing that was accomplished by a linguist by the name of Mark Okrand, who got his PhD from Berkeley, I believe, and was also a Star Trek fan, is that he invented a language for the Klingon people in the original Star Trek series, and they're still in the other series as well. This is at a time when it was not that common for people to develop languages from scratch like this, but it's become more common in the modern age. Especially, this is, I guess, one way linguists find work if they their PhD doesn't pan out for them in better ways, or other ways, I guess I should say. Because what's better than inventing a language? Anyways, the Klingon language has a word that's basically spelled like this, and it means fish. So Mark Okrand got the joke and didn't forget about it, and George Bernard Shaw will live on forever, or at least as long as Star Trek does. Okay, so the way we're going to solve all these problems is that we're going to use a phonetic alphabet. So in a phonetic alphabet, sounds and symbols have a one-to-one relationship to each other, and that's kind of the most crucial defining feature of them in terms of their value of how they are able to represent what people actually say. So what I mean by a one-to-one relationship is that each symbol that we use in writing or transcribing a segment of speech, each symbol represents one sound. Each sound is only going to be represented by one symbol, and that relationship is going to be 100% consistent over and over again. That's what makes the alphabet phonetic. So when we use a phonetic alphabet to represent speech in this way, it's called phonetic transcription, or we're transcribing something phonetically. Okay, our phonetic alphabet of choice is going to be the International Phonetic Alphabet. I've already kind of mentioned it once or twice here, I think, because, so it's abbreviated IPA, and it's one that I want you to use for a variety of reasons, one of which is that it is kind of the universal standard for phonetic alphabets. There are other phonetic alphabet options out there. I don't think, maybe around here somewhere. Yes, I have an old dictionary. You can tell it's old and used a lot because it looks like it's dying. But yeah, I don't know if you'll be able to see this, but I'll just open this up to a random page and put it up really close. But when you look at a dictionary, right, if you still have one in your home possessions, there are little transcriptions of how to pronounce each word. In this particular case, these are in brackets, slash brackets. Maybe you can see that, maybe you can't. And oftentimes the dictionaries use kind of an ad hoc system, which has certain commonalities with other transcription systems. But then they have to explain it, like at the beginning of the dictionary too, like what phonetic transcription system are we using. So maybe you can see this one a little bit better. So it's giving you the various sounds or symbols there, and it's telling you what sounds they represent. And it does certain things that we're going to do in this class as well, right? So like it's got a J symbol there, and it says, well, we see this in a word like job, or the sound at the beginning of gem, so on and so forth. So this is this is the Merriam-Webster phonetic alphabet for this particular document. There are also more standard alphabets like the American phonetic alphabet, which you may know a little bit about, but we're not going to use in this class. Like I said, I want to use one that's kind of a universal standard, so that if you go anywhere in the world and use this transcription system, people should be able to understand what you're transcribing. And it's also the one that's like universally used by linguists as well. So the IPA was presided over by the International Phonetic Association, and it was created in 1886. And I guess this is actually going to bring up one more point that I forgot to mention that students often do seize upon when I go over the trouble with English spelling. But English letters, or the letters in the English alphabet, are not necessarily enough to represent all the different sounds we might encounter in the world's languages, right? So actually, I was just looking at this little phonetic alphabet they have at the beginning of this dictionary. So maybe you can see this, maybe you can't, but it has a symbol for like a K, which is the sound we'd expect, like in kin or kitchen, or something like that. And then it has a K with an underline right underneath it. Hopefully you can see that maybe, which is supposed to represent the sound in the German word ich, and some pronunciations of the English word loch, like in Scotland, or buch, that sound. So it just came up with an ad hoc way of transcribing that by putting an underline underneath a K. We're not going to do that in using the IPA. The IPA is designed to have symbols for all the meaningfully contrastive sounds of the world's languages. So in the IPA, we're actually going to use the X symbol for that sound. So we don't, one of the other reasons for using the IPA is it's not only something that everybody uses universally, but it's designed to be usable universally. You should be able to use it for any language in the world. It has enough symbols to cover all the sounds that we need to worry about. That's why it takes a little while to learn it, but we'll get there by the end of the semester. So originally, the International Phonetic Association, when they created the IPA, was not really that universal. It was getting in that direction, but it was created in 1886, primarily by a group of language teachers in Western Europe, and I believe it was originally founded in France, which is where its headquarters are to this day, I believe. I'll give you a picture here of Paul Passy, who was the founder of the International Phonetic Association, now, 134 years ago? Yeah, this is him in his older age, I guess, reading something or other. One of the funny things about the International Phonetic Association and the IPA alphabet itself is that the creators of this alphabet were kind of gung-ho about like solving all the spelling problems of the world, because they thought, that would make it easier to learn languages, I guess. So they actually published a journal called the Journal of the IPA, and this journal still exists to this day. You can submit, academic research papers to it if you want, and they may or may not get published. They also hold conferences of the International Phonetic Association too. And originally, this journal was published using the IPA as a way to spell everything out in the journal. And believe it or not, this started in 1886 and it kept going until the 70s. I believe this is 1971, where they published the last version of this journal using the IPA as a spelling system. And the reason they decided to change is because, well, it just makes it a lot harder to read. Although when you do read it, and if you know the system, it's not that bad. So I'll read you through this, which is, as you might be able to see here, it's the last version of the IPA journal in IPA itself. So it says, the last MF. As members will know, this is the last number of the MF in its present form. Our journal was published for the first time in 1889, though previously, from 1886, it had appeared as the Phonetic Teacher. In 1889, our association had 321 members in 18 countries, the majority coming from Sweden, Germany, and France. Today, we have more than 800 members in over 40 countries, the great majority coming from the United States and Great Britain. Okay, so it's always kind of fun, but one thing you can get out of transcribing things phonetically is that you can capture accents, which get lost in sort of a standardized spelling system for one language. So if you hear somebody speaking in British English, you can transcribe the British English. If you hear somebody speaking in American English, you can transcribe the American English, so on and so forth. Like I said, they don't do this anymore, but it's something, maybe we'll pick back up again. Not once we learn the system. Okay, so the IPA is still active and evolving today. Like I said, they have regular conference meetings. They publish a journal as well. You can become a member if you want and partake in either of those activities. I kind of like to joke, they host a big conference called the International Congress of Phonetic Sciences every 4 years. So I joke that it's the Olympics of the Phonetics Olympics, rather. Usually it's in some major city somewhere around the world. So it's kind of cool. Everybody gets together and sees the old friends and finds out what they're up to. But at those meetings, or in general, the IPA association has to make decisions about the IPA alphabet itself. So you can still add new symbols to the IPA if it's deemed necessary or worthy. And the last addition to the IPA was a sound called the labiodental flap in 2005, which for me is not that long ago. For you, it might be a while back. But this symbol is represented with, or this sound is represented with this symbol. It looks like a V with kind of a curly Q on the right-hand side. And I'll play you an example of what this sounds like. Hopefully I've got sound. Yep.
Alurungu.
Maybe we'll make that a little bit louder.
Alurungu.
Right, so it's called a labiodental flap. This is from a language called Mono. This is the word for vehicle. It's spoken in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Central Africa. And basically, a labiodental flap, what that means is that you're curling your lower lip back under your upper row of teeth, and you're just kind of flapping it forward. So it makes brief contact between the lip and the teeth. I can show you a video of this, which I picked up about 15 years ago. It goes by pretty quick, and there's a mirror here to help you see what the lip is doing, or the lower lip is doing as this guy produces this sound, but I'll let you watch it a couple times. Yeah, so like I said, it goes by fast. I'll slow it down the second time. And he curls his lower lip back. You can see it going under the teeth, and then boom, there it goes. That's a labiodental flap. Yeah. I'm going to show you something else in this, which also goes by fast. But you might notice when he makes that t sound after the labiodental flap, you might watch his tongue. It makes contact with his upper row of teeth as well. And that's called a dental T. And that's a subtle distinction. Most English speakers pronounce a T a little bit further back, behind the teeth. Ta versus ta. But there's a way to transcribe that in the IPA as well, which we'll learn soon enough. Okay, so when the IPA has to decide whether or not it should add a new sound or what it should do in terms of reorganizing its existing system, it makes those decisions based on a set of principles to sort of keep things systematic and consistent and meaningful for that reason. So I'm going to walk you through the basic principles of the IPA to kind of give you a foundation for how it works, but this is from the IPA Association itself. So first of all, the use of a symbol in a transcription is a shorthand method to describe the articulation of that sound. So it's basically a claim that the speaker produced a certain combination of gestures and articulatory gestures. In other words, moved their vocal organs around in some particular way to produce a specific sound. That's the first one. The second one is kind of more essential in a way because it determines what can and cannot be represented in a transcription. So this is the principle of contrast. So this says that there should be a separate letter for each distinctive sound. That is, for each sound which being used instead of another in the same language can change the meaning of the word. So in this case, this boils the whole one-to-one correspondence principle down into a particular contrast or a specific principle. So in this case, we need to have one symbol corresponding to one sound and one sound corresponding to one symbol, so we get a consistent representation each time we use a symbol and each time we hear a sound. I guess I'm going to, before I expand on this a little bit, I'm going to go back to this first principle and add one note to it, which is that these symbols are supposed to represent articulatory reality, i.e. what you're doing with your organs of speech, and not necessarily some acoustic reality or a perceptual reality. We're trying to boil things down to something observable at the articulatory level. But it still matters in terms of whether or not specific sounds can make a contrast in a language. And those of you who did take 201, which I assume is all of you, can perhaps recognize in here that when they're talking about a sound that being used instead of another, it can change the meaning of a word. That is the idea of minimal pairs. So sound contrasts can be shown to exist in a language if you can find a minimal pair for them. So a minimal pair, if you remember, or even if you don't, consists of two words that have different meanings but differ from each other in only one sound. And that's the reason why those sounds are said to contrast with each other in these contexts, because by changing those sounds, you get different meanings, right? So a kind of basic example of a minimal pair in English that you see often in intro textbooks are a pair of words like pit and bit. So pit and bit would sound exactly the same if it were not for the different sounds at the beginning of the two words. So the P versus the B, they mean different things altogether. I'm not going to explain the meaning. I'm sure you know what both of them mean. But the way we can tell the difference between them is because we have those two different speech sounds at the start. Some students kind of see examples like that and get hung up on the idea that these are minimal pairs are only contrastive at the beginning of the words, but it doesn't have to be just at the beginning. It could be anywhere in the word. So at the end of a word, we can look at an example of sounds like beat versus bead, where we have a T here and a D here at the end of bead, and those are two different sounds. Everything else in those words sounds the same, basically. So we know that T and D are contrastive in English for that reason, because these two words have different meanings. That being said, you may notice that this vowel sound in the middle of these words, the E sound, is spelled differently in the two words. So here it's EE and here it's EA. One of the tricks with this class is that you have to learn how to ignore English spelling. It can provide you some clues sometimes or point you in the right direction occasionally. But like I said, there are a lot of problems with English spelling. So the sooner you forget about that and just listen for the sounds that you're producing in English, the better off you'll be in terms of transcribing those sounds. I'll say a little bit more about the difference in vowels that come before T and D later. There's a slight phonetic difference, but you don't need to worry about it for this example. We see a similar sort of situation for boat versus boot. These are two different vowel sounds. They involve similar spellings, but they're not the same. But this is O and this is oo. We're going to transcribe those with these symbols in the IPA, but this minimal pair in English basically just shows you that they are contrastive in English, that if you substitute one for the other, you'll change the two words altogether. My favorite minimal pair, in Western Canada at least, is carburetor versus garburator. So this shows you that there's a difference between the ka and the ga sounds at the beginning of these longer words. I knew what a carburetor was before I moved up to Canada. Sorry if I didn't tell you. I'm American originally. I've been here for about 13 years. And in 2007, I found out that there was a word called garburator in Western Canada mostly, which I would call a garbage disposal. But if you want to call it a garburator, then more power to you, because it helps us all have more fun. Okay, so number 3 principle. When any sound is found in several languages, the same sign should be used in all. And this applies to very similar shades of sound. So there is a symbol, as I mentioned on the previous slide, this oo symbol, which we're using for the vowel sound in a word like boot. This vowel sound, oo, can be found in a wide variety of different languages. However, the way it's actually pronounced might be a little bit different in different languages. So for French, the oo in French might be a little bit further back in your mouth than it is in English, where you might get oo, something like that. Korean, it's different again. But if they're reasonably close enough in the world of vowels, then we'll just use the same symbol across the board. We can tweak that a little bit using things called diacritics, but I'll say more about those in a second. Because this alphabet originated in Western Europe, which is a place where almost all of the spelling systems are derived from the ancient Roman alphabet, the International Phonetic Alphabet uses as much as possible of the ordinary letters of the Roman alphabet. This helps us to a certain extent because we're English speakers and we're used to looking at these letters. If you come from some other part of the world which doesn't, then you got more work to do, but hopefully we should be all on the same page at the start of this class as far as that's concerned. In assigning values to the Roman letters, though, international usage should decide. So this will cause you a little bit of difficulty if you're an English-only speaker. So let's go back to the vowel sound in a word like B, which we're spelling in English spelling with two E's next to each other. We use that, that's the sound that this letter is supposed to represent in English, E. But we're going to transcribe it with this symbol, which you may think of as the sound I, or the vowel combination I. And the reason why is because when you see this letter in most of the other European languages like German, French, and Spanish, it's pronounced as an E. And English is kind of the oddball in this case. English underwent a vowel shift, which is literally called the Great Vowel Shift between the years 1400 and 1600 approximately, where all these vowel sounds used to correspond to the same vowel sounds that we get for the other European languages. So in 1300 in England, this vowel would have been pronounced like an E. This would have been pronounced like an A, but then they just all kind of shifted around. nobody knows exactly why, but they're in different places now, and we have to kind of pay the price when we learn this. When we learn this alphabet, but it's okay because it makes it easier to learn other languages, right? But majority rules basically in that particular case. I've got a couple more for you, and then we'll move on to just a few examples to round this out. But number 6, the new letters. Keep doing that. The new letters should be suggestive of the sounds they represent by their resemblance to the old ones. So there's a new symbol we'll learn in this class, or maybe you remember it from 201. It's called angma, and it looks like kind of a combination of an N and a G, like the sound itself, which we get in a word like sing or song. This NG combination is just actually one phonetic sound, and that's the reason why we write it this way, is it kind of evokes the fact that we're combining these two sounds together into one to get this guy. The symbol we'll actually use for the sh sound in the IPA is not S followed by an H, but it's this elongated S sort of symbol, because esh is sort of similar to the S sound, so it's just kind of like a stretched out esh. And I cannot distinguish the two in my speech today, but hopefully this message is still getting across. I'm going to avoid those sounds altogether and see how far I get. Number 7, diacritic marks should be avoided, being trying for the eyes and troublesome to write. So diacritics are just little symbols you put above and below these sort of bigger alphabetic symbols in a transcription, and they can show you sort of finer grained differences in the pronunciation of that sound. So to go back to that example I gave you before, say if you had a real nice back French oo, and then you had an English oo, something like that, you could sort of transcribe that subtle distinction by putting a little minus symbol underneath the English oo as opposed to the French oo. Actually, I said that wrong. You put a little plus symbol underneath the English oo, and you would put a little minus symbol under the French oo, something like that. We'll learn that as we go, but generally speaking, the IPA says try to avoid that because it's a pain in the eye, basically. So for now, we will. Caveats. The IPA is not perfect. It is a useful tool for representing speech as a sequence of segments. It's not some sort of photographic absolute picture of reality. It's a screwdriver of linguistics. So phonetic transcription is an inexact science. One of the problems with it is impressionistic. So you base it on some impression you have of what somebody is saying as they're speaking. You can get more technical and get sort of objective data about what people are doing, either through an acoustic record or some articulatory measurement. But even so, transcribers can disagree when they're just listening to what somebody is saying. They can say, well, I thought he said an ooh, I thought he said an ooh, so on and so forth. So you have to sort of hash out those disagreements, which normally is something I'd like for us to do when we get together for those transcription exercises in class. So the problem with these impressions is that's kind of the foundation of making the transcriptions all together. Our goal is to figure out what this person is actually saying, what they're actually doing with their organs of speech when they produce sound. But we get there oftentimes through just perceiving what they've said. And you may already probably know this, but your perception of speech is molded by your native language background. So this is a very interesting phenomenon in language acquisition, but any child, when they're first born, has kind of this totally wide open mind because they don't know what sort of language environment they're going to be born in. So they have to be able to distinguish basically any sound in any of the world's languages. And they have the perceptual ability to do that as they're listening to the people speak around them. Around like 7-8 months, about that time, they start to lose the ability to perceive distinctions that are not in their native language. So if they haven't heard in their first half year of life, certain distinctions which aren't used in that language, then their mind just says, okay, I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to focus on what I'm actually dealing with, so I can get a leg up on actually trying to understand, this language at a higher level than just sounds. So we kind of start out all the same, and then we kind of get channeled into little boxes, which make it hard to communicate across languages, right? That's just the way the mind works. And when we do phonetic transcription, we have to sort of convince our minds to get out of those boxes and understand what's being said in a meaningful way in any language, right? transcend our own native language environment. And that's not really entirely possible to do, but I'm going to ask you to try to do it anyways. Production works in a similar way, and you have probably had this experience if you've ever tried to learn another language, right? So you may have had to learn sounds which do not exist in English. I think a classic example of this, because I get complaints about this sound every time I teach this class, but say if you are a native English speaker and you are trying to learn something like Spanish and you have to learn a trill sound like r, in perro or something like that. I'm not particularly good at it, but I can kind of get close enough. But a lot of students are like, I just can't do that sound. It's hard, right? So your production system zooms in on the sounds that you have to produce in your own language as well and says, we're going to work on these and we're not going to have to worry about every single sound in the world's languages because we're just one person. Like I said, though, in this class, we're going to kind of transcend our personal boundaries and go for the universal to as much of an extent as we can. I will say, though, one thing that will help us do this, like I said, if you're just listening to somebody speaking and say, oh, I think they said that, or I think they said that, it can be easier to get more objective about it if you can use machinery or electronic wizardry to help you understand what actually happened when somebody said something. So mechanical analysis can come in handy. And I'll show you an example of that. Here is what we call an acoustic waveform of a sample of speech. And what this shows you is just how air pressure changed over time. So this is air pressure in this dimension, and this is time in this dimension. So this is how air pressure changes as a person says a particular sentence in English. So this is kind of the pressure variations that hit your eardrums when you are actually listening to speech. We'll hear this in a second. And it's funny, like, this is all the information your mind needs to get. Well, with this information, your mind can figure out what's being said. When we look at it, rather than listening to it, it's hard to figure out what this is actually representing. I'll play it for you. Maybe you can take a guess at what this guy is saying before I play it, but here we go.
Where were you a year ago?
Where were you a year ago?
Where were you a year ago?
Yeah, so this will tell us exactly what happened as this guy said this sequence of words. One of the funny things that you may notice, though, is that when you listen to it, especially with this representation, your mind kind of places boundaries between meaningful parts of this utterance. So we all think of this in terms of like where the word boundaries are, but if we look up here, you don't really see any word boundaries. The only kind of clear gap we get between things is this for this sound g in the middle of a go. So there's a gap here, but that's not showing you a word boundary. It's just showing you kind of the middle of a word. So one word just kind of blends into the next in real speech. Our mind imposes that structure on top of it when we perceive it, but in an acoustic objective reality, one sound just flows into the next, which makes it, again, kind of hard to impose this sort of artificial structure on it when we're trying to do transcription. So real speech lacks the discreteness and strict sequentiality of alphabetic representations. That means phonetic transcriptions of speech are always going to be abstract. They're not exact pictures or photographs of objective reality. We're doing something a little more complicated than that. So when we do something like that, we have to figure out how abstract are we going to be? At what level do we want to represent reality or the abstractness in our transcriptions? So the IPA solution, which I've mentioned before, is that we're only going to capture contrastive differences between sounds. So this is principle number 2 in that list of 7 that I gave you. So I gave you also examples of the minimal pairs, which reflect or exemplify this particular principle as well. So if we have bit versus pit, the B versus P show you that these are 2 different words. You can also look at sort of a non-contrastive way of producing one of these words. So this is reflected in the way we produce the sound at the end of the word bit. So if you want to sort of enunciate it clearly and sort of clearly release that final stop sound, you can say bit, and maybe you can hear that little puff of air at the end of the T, bit. Or I could sort of swallow that T without releasing it in an obvious, audible way and say bit. So this is bit versus bit. And those are technically two different objective sounds, but in our minds, we do not care as English speakers because they both mean the word bit. Bit versus bit. But if we change the way we pronounce that first sound, bit versus pit, we get two different words, right? These are the same word. These are two different words. In the IPA, basically our goal is to be able to capture all of these possible contrasts in the various languages of the world. We're not going to worry about capturing all the possible non-contrastive sound differences in a language. This is an example which is commonly given in intro textbooks to linguistics. It's a little obscure though because it's so rare for anybody to listen to that subtle difference at the end of a word like bit. So I can give you another example, which is one I encountered when I moved up here again. So normally I like to ask this in class, but do you say these two names the same way or do you say them differently? They're spelled differently, right? But do you say them the same way or do you say them differently? I don't know. I've lived in different parts of the United States and it depends on where you come from in the US. But the way I would say this one is dawn, and this is dawn. Dawn, dawn, which is a very subtle distinction, which you may or may not be able to hear. Normally in Canada, nobody says these differently. But it's funny because in Canada, both pronunciations kind of glom onto the one pronunciation I use for this name. So I would say dawn and dawn. And a lot of Canadians just say dawn for both. So it's funny. The funny part of this is when I was driving up to Canada, when I moved here, I was driving up through like Saskatchewan or something. And I was like, cool, I'm in Canada, even though Saskatchewan is normally not that exciting, but it was exciting at the time. And I was listening to the CBC because I'm like, hey, Canada. So they were going to interview some guy for a radio show. And they're like, here comes, Dawn Taylor. And I was totally expecting, based on the way they said that it was going to be a female speaker. But when he started to speak, it was clearly a guy. So I was like, oh, man, what's going on with Canada? So I guess that made it more exciting. And like I said, it's worked out over time. But there are subtle distinctions between these two, which may not make a difference to you, but they might make a difference to somebody else. They might make a meaningful difference to somebody else. And as long as there's somebody else out there who can hear a distinction there, it's our job to be able to represent that. So the IPA has to represent all the contrast between sounds that are found in language, including some that we cannot easily hear. And if you pronounce these two names the same way, and I say dawn and dawn, it's probably hard for you to catch that difference, but we'll work on it using mechanical analysis to help us in order to transcribe those differences correctly. Okay, I'm not promising that anything will be easy in this class. I'm just promising that you'll get lots of practice no matter what it is we work on. Okay, so I'll also give you sort of a breakdown here about how to conceive of the sort of contrastive level and the not contrastive levels of sound in language. So at the contrastive level, we can talk about phonemes, which are basically representations of sound that can be used to distinguish between words in minimal pairs, like the B versus the P in bit and pit. Hopefully these words or terms are familiar from 201, but if they're not, this is the review part of this. There's another level at which we're dealing with allophones, which you can consider phonetic variants of a phoneme. So different allophones tend to occur in specific contexts, but they basically correspond to phonemes at different levels. So this is sort of what we get at the meaningful contrast level, and this is what we get not at a meaningful contrast level. It's just a contextual level you can kind of think of to describe these. And it's easier to understand this when I give you specific examples. So we'll go to the English phoneme T, which is one phoneme, and it can be used contrastively in different settings to contrast with different words, but it has a lot of different allophones. So, for example, there's an allophone of T called the aspirated T, which is what we get in a word like top. And that is, again, So just to walk you through the mechanics of producing a T. So with a T, you lift up the tip of your tongue to normally make contact with the little ridge behind your upper row of teeth. So in fact, it's usually easier to understand this if you kind of get familiar with your articulatory equipment. So I'm going to ask you to sort of lick that little ridge behind your upper row of teeth. You should be able to feel a bump there. And that's normally where you make contact between the tip of your tongue and the roof of your mouth when you make a T, like in top. Okay, but this is called an aspirated T. Why is that? Well, down here in your larynx, you have two vocal folds. And when you make a T like T in top, you leave your vocal folds open. So you release the T, and then air starts to flow out between your vocal folds, not making a sound, but it kind of sounds like a H, like an H sound. So we represent that with the T for that opening of the closure behind your teeth, and then the H for the opening of your vocal folds, and then eventually you close your vocal folds and start producing what we call voicing in the vowel after it. This contrasts with an unaspirated T, which is what we get in stop. So we write these the same way. There's a T symbol here, there's a T symbol here. They're both the same phoneme as well, and they probably sound the same to you too. So if we say stop, and you can kind of feel it at your alveolar ridge there, you can say, well, I'm doing the same thing for stop as I'm doing for top, right? But you're not. Because what you're doing differently is that you're timing the closure of these vocal folds differently. So in top, you leave them open as you produce the T, and then stop, they're basically closed, and then they start vibrating right after you release that. So I've gone on for quite a while here, but I will try to give you an exciting demo to make it worthwhile at the end. We should consider this a grand finale. I'm going to do it dangerously here. I'm going to get rid of all my flame suppressant in terms of this glass of water. And now I'm going to light a match. So what I'm going to do is I am going to light a match and say the word stop, holding the match, the lit match right in front of my mouth. And then I'm going to say the word top. And because there is a little puff of air that comes through my vocal folds after the T in top, that should blow out the match. But because there's no puff of air in stop, when I say stop first, the match should still be lit. Okay, so this normally works. Let's see how it goes this time. Rock and roll. Stop, top. Ta-da. There's a couple of different ways you can kind of prove this to yourself if you don't want to light a match in your home or office. I'll do it twice just to kind of replicate. Stop, top. Ta-da. Okay, so that little puff of air coming out after the T and top is called aspiration. If you don't want to light a match, you can put your hand in front of your mouth as you produce a word like top. You should be able to feel it. Versus stop, not so much, right? You could also grab a piece of paper and say one will do just fine. Top, top, stop, top, stop. So you should be able to see the paper moving with that aspiration there. This is a subtle difference. The reason why it's hard for us to believe this is because our minds are processing speech at the phoneme level. We're processing it at the meaningful level, not the non-meaningful level. So we hear the phonemes, and even though we're producing allophones, right? I'll give you another example. Like I said, T has a lot of different allophones. So the T in a word like metal is actually called a flap. So in this case, instead of raising the tip of your tongue up to just make contact with your alveolar ridge behind your teeth, you just kind of flap it up and make it make brief contact, like metal, metal, metal. So it doesn't stay there for very long. That's called a flap, and I think you can feel it. And it doesn't make any sort of meaningful difference. You could say, make this a complete stop, like metal, metal, and people would still understand what you're saying, right? Metal versus metal. And maybe it sounds a little like more clearly articulated if you say metal. So you might be doing it for that reason, but it doesn't change the meaning of the word. What it might change, though, is like a perception of where a speaker comes from. So in British English, they actually do pronounce metal with a clear stop there, metal, versus metal. So that's one way to distinguish between, say, British English speakers and North American English speakers. And I'm getting my eshes right somehow, all of a sudden, maybe. Anyways, that doesn't make a meaningful difference between the words. In fact, it doesn't even make a meaningful difference between a word that has a phoneme D in it, like metal, which is actually pronounced the exact same way as metal. Go figure. There's another allophone I can point out to you in this case, too. It's one we get in this word, mitten, the way it's normally pronounced by most American and Canadian English speakers. And it's called a glottal stop. So in mitten, depends on who you are, but and how you do this, but you can, instead of raising the tip of your tongue up to the roof of your mouth in mitten for that T, you can just close off your vocal folds, mitten, mitten, and make a stop of the airflow down here. So these, so this is sort of the sound you get in phrases like uh-oh, or button, or oh no you didn't, that sort of thing. It's a glottal stop rather than a genuine T. But at the same time, it's an allophone of this phoneme T. So it just appears in specific contexts. Okay, with that in mind, when we talk about transcription in English or any language, you can kind of talk about how the transcriptions work at two different levels. So at one level, you have what are called broad transcriptions that represent only contrastive sounds or phonemes. And they are generally only going to use alphabetic symbols. Like T, as we saw in the previous examples. So for all of these allophones here, if we were going to write out how to transcribe these words at a broad level, they would all use a T and slashes as their phonemic representation. But if we want to transcribe those same words in a narrow transcription, we're going to try to capture as much phonetic detail as possible. We're going to try to capture what are called the phones in the situation, which are the actual sounds that come out of a speaker's mouth. If we're capturing phonemes, then we're trying to capture meaningfully different sounds in a language. And when we try to create a narrow transcription, then it's fair game to use diacritics like the aspiration symbol or what have you to get specific details about how a word was actually produced. So I'm mentioning these both because there's kind of a sliding scale between narrow and broad transcriptions in phonetics. You can make a transcription sort of just solely broad and just only capture general meaningful contrasts in terms of the phonemes in your transcription and not worry about things like aspiration or whether it's glottal stop. Or you could start putting some of the aspiration in there, a little more phonetic detail, or you can just go whole hog and just make it as really particular and specific as you want when you do a narrow transcription. So there are kind of two ends of a spectrum there with a lot of gray area in the middle. But what I'm going to say is that in this class, when you do write out phonetic transcriptions, like for exercises in class or wherever, enclose the IPA symbols in brackets, and that means that you're aiming at a narrow transcription. You're aiming at trying to capture the phonetic detail of what a speaker actually said. If you're doing like a phonology problem in phonology class or just for fun at home, then you can use the slash brackets to show what your initial transcription of a form might be. And that will, again, still messing those up, but that will let you know that you're just trying to transcribe abstract phonemes or abstract contrast differences between two words in a language. This is not showing that you're trying to capture some sort of objective reality. It's showing that you're trying to capture some sort of linguistic meaningful difference. This, if you use square brackets, is what you use in this class to say, I'm trying to get a phonetic transcription down of what the speaker actually said, what sounds they actually produced. Okay, I've been going on for some time here, so I'm going to wrap this up by talking about the morals of the story. There are broad transcriptions, there are narrow transcriptions, there's sort of some leeway in between. There's also different perspectives that people have as different listeners when they hear the same token of speech. So there can actually be more than one right way to transcribe an utterance. And in this class, I'm not going to judge you or dock you any points if you sort of use an appropriate way to transcribe an utterance or maybe an alternative way to transcribe an utterance as long as it's fitting for what sounds the speaker actually produced. I will only dock you points in any situation if you're using, say, symbols that are not appropriate that do not represent the sound that somebody actually used when they pronounced some token that we're listening to. The IPA enables us to record all the possibly meaningful phonetic detail in an utterance. We don't always have to transcribe all of that detail, but it enables us to do that, and that's kind of our goal, to be able to do that at the end of the day or at the end of the semester. And it's also useful, not only because it can do that, but because it is a human thing, and language is a human thing, right? So the IPA is portable as long as you have it in your brain. It doesn't require electricity or some sort of gadget or tablet or whatever for you to use. If you have like a notebook and a pencil, you can still make it work. It's universal as well, which is also kind of maybe more important than the technological advantages it has. It's traditional, so people have been using it for over 100 years, and it's also relatively simple. It just takes a fair amount of memory work to learn all the symbols, right? And also some practice to learn how to use them. So for all these reasons, I want you to learn this in this semester, and hopefully that breakdown makes sense. But like I said, we're going to focus on being able to make narrow transcriptions in this class using the symbols available to us in this systemic tool that we get through the IPA. So it's going to be useful to you for the rest of your life anytime you want to figure out what a person is saying or how to communicate what a person is saying to somebody else, especially linguists. Okay, I've gone on definitely long enough for this. So next time we'll talk about what symbols we use when we transcribe English and going through the system of English phonemes. So I'll be looking forward to that, and I will be looking forward to seeing you there along with me too. Until then.